The morning air in the Galactic Academy felt heavy with excitement and fear. Jake Martinez sat in the back row of the huge classroom and watched his alien classmates whisper to each other in their strange languages. The room buzzed with nervous energy as everyone waited for Professor Zethkar to arrive. Jake looked around at his fellow students and still felt amazed that he was here. The Vorthan twins, Kex and Vex, were made of living crystal that changed colors when they talked. Their bodies sang with musical notes that other students had learned to understand as words. Next to them sat Helix 9, a creature with 6 arms that moved like water and skin that looked like metal. The being came from a gas planet where gravity worked differently than anywhere else. In the front row sat Quell Prime, the telepathic student who never spoke out loud, but somehow everyone could hear its thoughts in their minds. The Quell had smooth gray skin and large black eyes that seemed to see through everything. Jake had heard that no Quell had ever failed a test at the Academy in over 300 years. There were 9 other alien students from species Jake was still learning about. Some breathed different air and wore special masks. Others had to sit in special chairs because their bodies were shaped so differently from humans. Each one came from a civilization that had mastered space travel for thousands of years before humans had even invented the wheel. Jake was the first human ever accepted into the Galactic Academy of Xenobiology. His people had only joined the galactic community 50 years ago, and most aliens still thought of humans as a young and simple species. Jake knew that every eye in the Academy was watching to see if a human could keep up with the most advanced minds in the galaxy. The door slid open with a soft hiss and Professor Zethkar entered the room. The professor was tall and thin with blue skin and 4 eyes that could look in different directions at the same time. He moved with the grace of someone who had lived for over 500 years and had taught thousands of students from hundreds of different worlds. "Students," Professor Zethkar said in the universal language that all Academy members had to learn. His voice carried easily through the room even though he spoke quietly. "Today marks your final examination for advanced xenobiology. This test will determine whether you graduate with honors or leave the Academy in failure." Jake felt his heart beat faster. He had worked for 3 years to get to this moment. His grades were good but not the best in the class. Several of his alien classmates had abilities that made learning much easier for them. The Vorthan twins could process information at the speed of light. Helix 9 could run multiple thought processes at the same time with its complex brain. Quell Prime could simply read the minds of professors and learn everything instantly. "Your assignment," the professor continued, "is to capture a living specimen of the Theta 7 beetle from the forest moon of Kepler 442b. You must bring the creature back alive and unharmed for behavioral study." Jake had heard of Theta 7 beetles before. They were famous throughout the galaxy for being impossible to catch. The creatures were incredibly fast and could change color to match their surroundings perfectly. They seemed to sense danger from great distances and would disappear long before any hunter could get close to them. Many of the galaxy's best scientists had tried to study them but had never managed to capture even one. "These creatures," Professor Zethkar explained, "have avoided capture by every known method. They can detect most forms of technology from miles away and will flee before any trap can be set. They move faster than most scanning equipment can track, and their camouflage abilities make them nearly impossible to see even when you know where to look." The Vorthan twins began humming in harmony as they communicated with each other. Jake could see their crystal bodies glowing brighter as they got excited about the challenge. Helix 9 was already moving its 6 arms in complex patterns as it started planning its approach. Quell Prime sat perfectly still, but Jake could feel the telepathic energy radiating from its mind as it began to think through the problem. "You have 72 standard hours to complete this task," the professor said. "Failure means immediate expulsion from the Academy. Success means graduation with full honors and your choice of research positions throughout the galaxy." Jake listened as his classmates began discussing their plans. The Vorthan twins talked about using quantum displacement nets that could shift between dimensions to catch creatures that normal traps could never hold. They spoke of energy fields that could bend space and time to create inescapable zones. Helix 9 was already sketching plans for gravitational manipulation devices that could create artificial gravity wells to trap the beetles. Its 6 arms moved independently as it calculated the precise mathematical formulas needed to bend the laws of physics to its will. Quell Prime remained silent, but Jake could sense its thoughts reaching out to probe the mental patterns of the Theta 7 beetles. The telepathic student was planning to use psychic lures to draw the creatures into stasis chambers where they would be frozen in time until they could be studied. Other students discussed using molecular scanners worth more than most planets' entire budgets, or temporal displacement fields that could slow time around the beetles until they could be easily collected. Each plan involved technology that Jake could barely understand, much less afford to use. Jake smiled to himself as he listened to their complex schemes. While his classmates talked about quantum physics and dimensional manipulation, his mind wandered back to summers spent with his grandfather in the mountains of Montana. He remembered the old man teaching him how to track deer through the forest and how to catch fish with nothing but a simple hook and line. The secret, his grandfather had always said, is not to be smarter than the animal. The secret is to understand what the animal wants and give it to them in a way that helps you too. Jake thought about the camping trips where his grandfather had caught rare butterflies using nothing but patience and the right kind of flowers. He remembered watching the old man sit perfectly still for hours, until the most skittish creatures would come close enough to touch. As the class broke up and students rushed off to gather their expensive equipment, Jake headed in a different direction. While his classmates went to the advanced technology laboratories to build machines worth millions of credits, Jake walked slowly toward the Academy's basic chemistry station and the simple greenhouse where students grew plants for their biology classes. He had an idea that none of his classmates would ever think of, and it did not require any technology at all. Jake stood at the edge of the forest moon and breathed in the strange, sweet air. While his classmates spent their first day building complex machines and setting up expensive equipment, he had taken the earliest transport to Kepler 442b to do something much simpler. He wanted to watch the beetles and learn how they lived. The forest moon was beautiful in a way that made Jake think of Earth, tall trees with silver bark stretched up toward 2 small suns that painted everything in soft, golden light. Strange flowers bloomed in colors that had no names and filled the air with scents that reminded him of home but were completely alien at the same time. Jake found a good spot near a clearing where the Academy's research files said the beetles liked to feed. He set up a basic observation blind using branches and leaves, then settled in to wait. He had brought nothing with him except a simple notebook, a pair of basic binoculars, and enough food and water to last several days. Hours passed and Jake saw nothing. The 2 suns moved across the sky in their slow dance, and the light changed from golden to orange to deep red. Just as Jake began to think that maybe the beetles did not come to this area anymore, something moved at the edge of his vision. A Theta 7 beetle stepped delicately into the clearing. Jake held his breath and stayed perfectly still. The creature was about the size of his thumb, and its shell shifted through colors like an oil spill in sunlight. One moment it was deep green like the moss on the trees, the next it was brown like the earth, then silver like the bark. Jake watched in amazement as the beetle moved toward a cluster of blue flowers. But as he observed more carefully, he noticed something strange. The beetle did not seem to be eating the flowers. Instead, it walked around them in a complex pattern, stopping every few steps to touch its antennae to different parts of the plant. More beetles appeared from the forest. They all followed similar patterns, but each one traced a slightly different path around the flowers. Jake realized he was watching some kind of communication or ritual that no scientist had ever documented before. He watched for hours as the beetles continued their strange dance. As the light faded and the forest prepared for night, the beetles began to disappear back into the trees. But they did not all leave at once. Instead, they departed in a specific order, with some beetles waiting until others had left before beginning their own journey back to wherever they spent the dark hours. Jake made careful notes about everything he saw: the timing of their arrival, the patterns they followed around the flowers, the order in which they left. Most importantly, he began to understand that the beetles were not just random insects looking for food. They were following complex social behaviors that served purposes he was only beginning to guess at. Meanwhile, back at the Academy's temporary research station, his classmates were having very different experiences. The Vorthen twins had arrived with a transport ship full of quantum displacement equipment. Their machines hummed with energy and created light shows that could be seen from orbit. They spent the entire first day calibrating sensors and setting up energy fields Helix 9 had brought, gravitational manipulation devices that were so powerful they required special permits just to transport them. The six-armed student worked tirelessly to position the machines in precise mathematical arrangements that would create inescapable gravity wells. Quell Prime had established a psychic amplification array that boosted its telepathic abilities across vast distances. The equipment was so sensitive that it could detect the thoughts of simple insects from miles away, or so the specifications claimed. But as Jake continued his quiet observation, something interesting began to happen. Every time one of his classmates activated their equipment, the beetles would vanish from the surrounding area. The quantum energy from the Vorthen devices seemed to trigger some kind of alarm response in the creatures. The gravitational distortions from Helix 9's machines caused every animal in the forest to flee in panic. Quell Prime's psychic probes created what could only be described as mental static that drove the beetles deeper into the forest where the telepathic signals could not reach them. The more sophisticated the equipment became, the farther away the beetles retreated. Jake watched this happening from his simple observation post and began to understand something important: the Theta 7 beetles had not survived for millions of years by being bigger or stronger than their predators. They had survived by being incredibly sensitive to danger and all the advanced technology his classmates were using registered as massive threats to creatures whose entire evolutionary history had taught them to flee from anything unnatural. On the second day, Jake moved his observation post to a different part of the forest. He had noticed that the beetles seemed to follow specific paths between different types of flowers, and he wanted to understand the pattern better. As he watched, he began to see that the beetles were not just visiting flowers randomly. They were following scent trails. Each beetle would spend time at certain flowers, then move in a straight line to other specific plants. But they were not eating nectar or pollen. Instead, they seemed to be following invisible pathways that connected different parts of the forest. Jake realized that the beetles were using chemical signals to communicate with each other across great distances. He began collecting samples of the flowers and plants that the beetles visited most often. Using his basic field kit, he carefully preserved leaves, petals, and even soil samples from around the most popular beetle gathering spots. He made detailed notes about which plants the beetles preferred and what times of day they visited each type. Professor Zethkar arrived on the second day to check on his students' progress. He found the Vorthen twins surrounded by enough technology to power a small city, but their quantum nets had not caught a single beetle. Helix 9 had created gravitational distortions so powerful that they were affecting the moon's tides, but the gravity wells remained empty. Quell Prime reported that its psychic probes had detected beetle minds, but that the creatures seemed to vanish the moment any telepathic contact was attempted. The student had increased the power of its amplification array to dangerous levels, but had achieved no results. When the professor found Jake sitting quietly in the forest with nothing but a notebook and a collection of plant samples, he seemed puzzled. "Student Martinez," Professor Zethkar said, "I do not see any capture equipment. How do you plan to complete the assignment?" Jake looked up from his notes and smiled. "I'm still learning about them, Professor. I think I'm beginning to understand how they think, but I need to figure out what they really want before I can give it to them." The professor studied Jake's simple setup and the careful notes he had been making. Your classmates are using the most advanced technology available in the galaxy, he pointed out. Do you believe you can succeed where they are failing? Jake nodded toward the clearing where just an hour before, a group of beetles had performed their complex ritual around the blue flowers. Professor, I think maybe the beetles are not hiding from us because we are not smart enough to catch them. I think they are hiding from us because we are trying too hard to be smarter than they are. Professor Zethkar considered this statement for a long moment. In all his centuries of teaching, he had never heard a student suggest that intelligence might be a disadvantage. As he walked back toward the research station where his other students were frantically increasing the power levels of their already impressive machines, he found himself wondering if the human might be onto something that none of them had considered. Jake walked into the Academy's basic chemistry laboratory carrying his collection of plant samples from the forest moon. The lab was small and simple compared to the advanced research facilities where his classmates were working. It had glass containers, heating elements, and basic distillation equipment that looked like something from a high school on Earth. Dr. Vex, the elderly Cloxian lab supervisor, looked up from his work when Jake entered. The old alien had gray skin covered in small scales and eyes that had seen centuries of students come and go through the academy. Most students avoided the basic labs in favor of the high-tech facilities, so Dr. Vex was surprised to see anyone, especially a student working on the final examination. "What can I help you with, young human?" Dr. Vex asked in his creaky voice. He spoke the universal language slowly and carefully, as if he had learned it long ago and was still not completely comfortable with it. Jake spread his plant samples out on one of the work tables and explained what he had observed on the forest moon. He told Dr. Vex about the beetles following invisible pathways between different flowers, and how they seemed to be communicating through chemical signals rather than just feeding on nectar. Dr. Vex became more interested as Jake described his observations. The old scientist had worked at the academy for over 200 years and had seen countless students attempt to study the Theta 7 beetles. Most of them focused on the creature's speed and camouflage abilities, but none had ever paid attention to their chemical communication systems. "You think they are following scent trails?" Dr. Vex asked, examining the flower samples with a magnifying lens. "This is very interesting. In all my years here, no student has ever considered that the beetles might be using their environment to send messages to each other." Jake nodded and pulled out his notebook. He showed Dr. Vex his careful drawings of the paths the beetles had followed and the timing of their visits to different plants. "I think each type of flower produces a different chemical signal," he explained. "The beetles are not just looking for food. They are reading and leaving messages." Dr. Vex studied Jake's notes and began to get excited. "If you are correct," the old scientist said, "then these beetles have developed one of the most sophisticated chemical communication systems ever discovered. But how do you plan to use this information to capture one of them?" Jake smiled and began setting up the distillation equipment. "My grandfather taught me how to make lures for fishing," he said. "He always said that if you want to catch something, you need to give it what it wants most. I think what these beetles want most is to find each other." Dr. Vex watched with fascination as Jake began the process of extracting essential oils from the flower samples. The human used techniques that were centuries old but perfectly effective. He heated the plant material gently and captured the vapors in glass tubes, then cooled them back into liquid form. "You are making a concentrated attractant," Dr. Vex realized. "By combining the chemical signals from all the different flowers, you hope to create a lure that will be more attractive to the beetles than anything they would find in nature." Jake nodded as he carefully measured and mixed different concentrations of the extracted oils. "The beetles follow these scent trails because they are looking for mates, food, and safe places to live," he explained. "If I can make a mixture that signals all of those things at once, they should be drawn to it." Meanwhile, back on the forest moon, Jake's classmates were becoming more desperate. The Vorthan twins had expanded their quantum displacement nets to cover half the forest. The energy fields they were generating were so intense that they interfered with the moon's communication satellites and created aurora-like lights in the atmosphere. Helix-9 had deployed 17 different types of sensors and traps throughout its assigned area. The forest floor was covered with blinking lights and mechanical devices that hummed and clicked constantly. The student had created such a maze of technology that even other Academy researchers were getting lost trying to navigate through it. Quell-Prime had given up on subtle telepathic approaches and was now broadcasting psychic signals at maximum power. The telepathic student had discovered that the beetles' minds operated on frequencies that caused painful feedback when contacted directly. Each attempt to reach out to them mentally resulted in severe headaches for both the student and any beetles. Within range, other classmates had deployed molecular scanners, temporal displacement fields, and energy barriers that could stop anything from moving faster than light. The combined power output from all their equipment was so great that it created its own electromagnetic field around their research area, but despite all their advanced technology and sophisticated approaches, none of them had seen a single Theta 7 beetle since the first day. The creatures had retreated so far into the deep forest that even long-range sensors could not detect them. Back in the chemistry lab, Jake continued his careful work. He created several different versions of his attractant, each one with a slightly different combination of chemical signals. Dr. Vex helped him understand which compounds were most important for insect communication and how to balance them properly. No, Dr. Vex said as they worked together. In all my centuries of research, I had forgotten how elegant simple solutions can be. Your classmates are using technology that costs more than most planetary budgets, but you are working with the same principles that insects have used to find each other for millions of years. Jake tested each version of his mixture on small samples of the plant material to see which one produced the strongest chemical reaction. He was looking for the perfect balance that would attract the beetles without overwhelming their sensitive chemical receptors. The key, Jake explained as he worked, is not to be louder than nature. It is to be more concentrated and more appealing, but still natural enough that the beetles will trust it. Dr. Vex marveled at the human's approach. Most students at the Academy had been trained to solve problems by applying superior technology and overwhelming force. But Jake was thinking like the creatures he wanted to catch, trying to understand their needs and desires rather than simply overpowering them. As the second day ended, Jake had created his final mixture. It was a clear, sweet-smelling liquid that contained the concentrated essence of every chemical attractant that the Theta 7 beetles naturally sought. The scent was pleasant but not overpowering, familiar but more intense than anything the beetles would encounter in their normal environment. Dr. Vex helped Jake prepare a simple delivery system for his lure. They used a basic glass container with small holes that would allow the scent to disperse slowly and naturally. The entire trap was so simple that it could have been built by a child, but it was based on a deep understanding of beetle biology and behavior. Your classmates will arrive tomorrow with machines worth millions of credits, Dr. Vex observed as they finished their work. You are going to compete against them with equipment that costs less than their power supplies. Jake smiled and carefully sealed his attractant in a small bottle. My grandfather always said that the best solutions are usually the simplest ones, he replied. Sometimes the hardest part is not building something complicated enough to solve the problem. Sometimes the hardest part is keeping it simple enough to actually work. Dr. Vex watched the young human pack up his simple equipment and wished him luck. In all his years at the Academy, he had never seen a student approach a problem with such humility and patience. As Jake left the lab carrying nothing more than a glass container and a small bottle of homemade beetle attractant, Dr. Vex found himself hoping that sometimes wisdom could triumph over technology. Jake returned to the forest moon on the final day carrying only a small backpack with his simple equipment. The morning air was crisp and filled with the sounds of alien birds welcoming the two suns as they rose above the horizon, while his classmates were making their last desperate attempts with even more powerful technology. Jake walked quietly through the forest. To find the perfect location for his trap, he had spent 2 days watching the beetles and learning their habits. He knew which clearings they visited most often and what times of day they were most active. Most importantly, he understood that the beetles followed specific pathways through the forest, invisible highways marked by chemical signals that connected their feeding areas to their nesting sites. Jake found a small clearing that his observations had revealed as a major intersection of beetle pathways. Several different scent trails crossed here, making it a natural gathering point where beetles from different parts of the forest would meet and exchange information. The location was perfect for what he had planned. He set up his trap in the center of the clearing using nothing more than a basic glass container and a standard specimen collection box that he had borrowed from the Academy's supply room. The entire setup cost less than the batteries that powered his classmates' scanning equipment. Jake carefully applied 3 drops of his concentrated attractant to a small piece of cloth and placed it inside the glass container. The sweet scent began to spread through the clearing immediately, carrying chemical messages that spoke directly to the beetles' most basic instincts for finding food, mates, and safety. Then Jake did something that none of his technologically advanced classmates had thought to do. He retreated far enough away from his trap that his own human scent would not interfere with the carefully balanced chemical signals he had created. He found a comfortable spot in his observation blind and settled in to wait with the patience his grandfather had taught him during those long summers in Montana. Meanwhile, across the forest, his classmates were engaged in increasingly frantic efforts to complete their assignment before the deadline. The Vorthen twins had created quantum distortions so powerful that they were affecting the weather patterns on the entire moon. Their energy fields generated lightning storms and caused the temperature to fluctuate wildly across their research area. Helix 9 had deployed gravitational manipulators that were causing minor earthquakes every few minutes. The 6-armed student had realized that its original approach was not working and had begun combining different technologies in desperate combinations. Gravity wells, molecular scanners, and temporal displacement fields all operated simultaneously, creating a technological chaos that could be detected from the next star system. Quell Prime had abandoned telepathic approaches entirely and borrowed scanning equipment from 3 other species. The student had created a hybrid device that looked like something from a mad scientist's laboratory. Energy beams swept back and forth across the forest while psychic amplifiers boosted the detection range to impossible levels. The combined energy output from all their equipment was so intense that it created electromagnetic interference that affected communication systems throughout the local sector. Ships passing through the star system had to adjust their navigation to avoid the artificial energy fields that the students were generating. But despite all their advanced technology and unlimited resources, none of them had detected a single beetle in over 24 hours. The creatures had been driven so deep into the forest that they might as well have vanished from the moon entirely. Jake waited patiently in his hiding spot and watched his simple trap. For the first hour, nothing happened. The forest was quiet except for the distant sounds of his classmates' machines humming and clicking in the distance. Then, just as Jake was beginning to wonder if his approach would work, he saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A single Theta 7 beetle emerged from the undergrowth and moved cautiously toward the center of the clearing. The creature's shell shifted through its characteristic range of colors as it approached the glass container, but Jake could see that it was not displaying the rapid color changes that indicated fear or stress. Instead, the beetle moved with the confident gait of an insect that had found exactly what it was looking for. The beetle reached the trap and began circling the glass container in the same complex pattern that Jake had observed during his days of watching their natural behavior. The creature was reading the chemical signals in his attractant and finding them not only familiar, but irresistibly appealing. Within minutes, more beetles began to appear from all directions. They emerged from hiding spots that Jake had not even suspected existed, drawn by the concentrated scent that perfectly mimicked their natural communication system. Soon the clearing was filled with Theta 7 beetles displaying behaviors that no galactic scientist had ever recorded. Jake watched in amazement as the beetles began to interact with each other in ways that revealed the complexity of their social structure. Some beetles clearly held higher status than others and were given priority access to the strongest scent signals. Younger beetles waited respectfully while older ones completed elaborate chemical exchanges that seemed to convey detailed information about food sources and territorial boundaries. Professor Zethkar had been monitoring all his students' progress from his observation post in orbit above the moon. His instruments showed him the massive energy expenditures and technological deployments that most of his class was using, but they also showed him something much more interesting. In one small clearing where no artificial energy was being generated, his sensors detected the largest concentration of Theta-7 beetle activity ever recorded. The professor used his transport to fly down to the forest and investigate this anomaly. He found Jake sitting quietly in his observation blind, documenting beetle behaviors that xenobiologists had been trying to study for centuries. The human student had not only completed the assignment of capturing a specimen, but had created the first successful research station for observing natural beetle behavior. "Student Martinez," Professor Zethkar said quietly as he approached Jake's position, "my instruments indicate that you have attracted an entire colony of beetles to this location. How have you accomplished what your classmates with their advanced technology have been unable to do?" Jake showed the professor his simple trap and explained his methodology. He described how he had spent days observing the beetles' natural behavior instead of immediately trying to capture them. He explained his theory about chemical communication and how he had created an attractant that worked with the beetles' instincts rather than against them. Professor Zethkar examined Jake's setup with growing amazement. The entire apparatus was so basic that it would not have looked out of place in a primitive laboratory, yet it had achieved results that the most sophisticated technology in the galaxy had failed to produce. "Your classmates are using equipment worth more than most planetary defense systems," the professor observed. "You have succeeded with materials that cost less than their daily meal allowances. How do you explain this?" Jake smiled and pointed toward the clearing where dozens of beetles continued their complex social interactions around his simple trap. "Professor, I think maybe we have been trying to catch these beetles by being smarter than they are," he said. "But they have been avoiding capture for millions of years by being very good at recognizing threats. All that advanced technology just tells them to run away." Professor Zethkar watched the beetles for several minutes, observing behaviors that would revolutionize the field of xenobiology. The creatures were completely relaxed and natural, displaying their full range of social and communication patterns because they had been attracted rather than captured, drawn in by their own desires, rather than trapped by superior force. "Student Martinez," the professor said finally, "you have not only completed your assignment, you have opened an entirely new field of research. These observations will change how we study insect species throughout the galaxy." Jake carefully collected several beetles in his specimen container, making sure to choose representatives from different age groups and social positions. The creatures remained calm throughout the process because they had been attracted to the location voluntarily and were not experiencing the stress and trauma that usually accompanied capture attempts. As the deadline approached, Jake had not only succeeded in his mission but had demonstrated that sometimes the most advanced solution was also the simplest one. The evaluation chamber at the Galactic Academy buzzed with tension as the final examination deadline approached. Professor Zethkar sat at the head of a curved table alongside 5 other distinguished faculty members who had come to witness the results of the most challenging test in xenobiology. Each student would present their captured specimens and explain their methodology to determine who would graduate with honors and who would leave the academy in failure. Jake sat quietly in the back of the chamber while his classmates fidgeted nervously with their equipment. The Vorthan twins' crystal bodies flickered with worried light patterns as they prepared to explain why their quantum displacement nets had failed to capture anything. Helix 9 moved its 6 arms in agitated patterns while reviewing calculations that had somehow gone wrong despite being mathematically perfect. Quell Prime, remained silent, but everyone in the room could feel the waves of anxiety radiating from its telepathic mind. The other alien students clutched their empty specimen containers and rehearsed explanations for why the most advanced technology in the galaxy had proven inadequate for catching simple insects. Professor Zethkar called the examination to order and announced that each student would have exactly 10 minutes to present their results. The presentations would be evaluated not only on success or failure, but on the scientific methodology and understanding demonstrated by each approach. The Vorthan twins went first, their crystal bodies singing a harmony of regret as they explained their quantum displacement technology. They had created energy fields that could phase shift between dimensions and nets that could capture particles moving at the speed of light. Their equipment had functioned perfectly according to all specifications, generating quantum distortions that were visible from space. Our calculations were flawless, Kex harmonized while Vex provided a musical counterpoint. The quantum nets should have been able to capture any physical creature regardless of speed or camouflage abilities. We cannot explain why the beetles avoided our traps. The faculty members made notes while the twins presented detailed readouts from their sensors. The technology was impressive and the theoretical framework was sound, but their specimen container remained empty. Professor Zethkar thanked them politely and called for the next presentation. Helix 9 approached the presentation area with its 6 arms carrying multiple data tablets and sensor readings. The student had deployed gravitational manipulation, devices that could bend space-time itself, creating inescapable gravity wells that should have drawn in any creature within a vast radius. The gravitational mathematics were precise, Helix 9 explained in its liquid voice. I created 17 different types of attraction fields and monitored them with sensors capable of detecting individual molecules. The beetles should have been unable to resist the gravitational forces, yet none were captured. The faculty reviewed Helix 9's impressive technical achievements while noting that its specimen container was also empty. The student had demonstrated mastery of advanced physics but had failed to understand the biological aspects of the assignment. Quell Prime stepped forward and placed its empty container on the presentation table without saying a word. Instead, it projected its thoughts directly into the minds of everyone present, sharing the experience of its attempts to contact the beetles telepathically. The assembled faculty felt the alien mental frequencies that had caused such painful feedback. When Quell Prime tried to communicate with the insects, they experienced the confusion and frustration of a telepathic mind encountering creatures whose thoughts operated on completely different principles. I attempted to understand their mental patterns, Quell Prime's thoughts explained, but their minds were too alien for direct contact. The psychic amplification equipment functioned properly, but the beetles seemed to experience my telepathic presence as a form of attack. One by one, the other students presented their failures. Each had used technology worth millions of credits and had demonstrated advanced understanding of their respective scientific specialties. But every specimen container remained empty and every explanation boiled down to the same basic problem. The beetles had refused to cooperate with their capture attempts. Finally, Professor Zethkar called Jake to present his results. The human student walked to the front of the chamber carrying a single specimen container and his simple notebook. Unlike his classmates' elaborate technical presentations, Jake's equipment could fit easily on the small presentation table. Jake opened his specimen container and the faculty members leaned forward in amazement. Inside were 6 Theta 7 beetles representing different age groups and behavioral types. More remarkably, the creatures appeared calm and active, displaying natural behaviors instead of the stress responses that usually accompanied capture. How is this possible? Asked Dr. Vell, the Academy's senior xenobiologist. These creatures have avoided capture by the galaxy's best scientists for decades. What technology did you use that your classmates did not? Jake smiled and showed the faculty his simple glass trap and the small bottle of concentrated attractant. I did not use any advanced technology, Professor. I spent the first 2 days watching the beetles and learning how they communicate with each other. Then I used basic chemistry to create a scent that would attract them naturally. The faculty members examined Jake's equipment with growing astonishment. Dr. Vex had arrived to witness the presentation and confirmed that Jake had created his attractant using nothing more than plant extracts and simple distillation techniques that were centuries old. "You mean to tell me," said Dr. Korth, the Academy's physics specialist, "that you succeeded where quantum displacement technology failed by using primitive chemistry and observation?" Jake nodded and opened his notebook to show his careful drawings of beetle behavior patterns. The beetles were not avoiding capture because they were too fast or too well camouflaged, he explained. They were avoiding capture because all the advanced technology registered as threats to their survival instincts. He showed the faculty his notes about chemical communication and explained how the beetles use scent trails to coordinate their social activities. Instead of trying to catch them with superior technology, I gave them what they wanted most: stronger and clearer chemical signals than they could find anywhere in nature. Professor Zethkar studied Jake's methodology with deep interest. "So you succeeded by understanding their biology rather than overpowering it with technology?" "Yes, Professor," Jake replied. "My grandfather taught me that the best way to catch something is not to be smarter than it, but to understand what it needs and help it get that while achieving your own goals at the same time." The faculty spent several minutes observing Jake's captured beetles, noting behaviors that had never been documented before. The creatures were displaying complex social interactions and communication patterns that revealed new insights into their species. Dr. Vex stood up to address the chamber. "In all my centuries at this academy," the old Cloxian said, "I have never seen a student demonstrate such clear understanding of the fundamental principles of biology. Student Martinez has not only completed the assignment, he has revolutionized our approach to xenobiological research." Professor Zethkar nodded in agreement. "Student Martinez, your success challenges basic assumptions about how intelligence should be applied to scientific problems. Your classmates use the most advanced technology available, but you succeeded by applying wisdom and patience." The other faculty members agreed unanimously that Jake had not only passed the examination but had demonstrated the kind of thinking that would advance scientific knowledge throughout the galaxy. His simple approach had achieved what advanced technology could not by working with natural systems, rather than against them. Jake graduated at the top of his class and was offered research positions at institutions throughout the galaxy. But more importantly, his methodology was incorporated into the Academy's standard curriculum. Future xenobiologists would be taught to observe and understand, before attempting to capture and control, the story of the human who caught the uncatchable. Beetles spread throughout the galactic scientific community. Jake's success became a legend that proved humanity's greatest strength was not their technology, but their ability to find simple solutions to complex problems by understanding the natural world and working with it rather than against it. Years later, as Jake traveled the galaxy studying creatures that had baffled advanced civilizations for millennia, he always carried the same simple equipment: basic observation tools, patience learned from his grandfather, and the understanding that sometimes the most sophisticated solution was also the most humble one.